2011 for the environment in maritime seems to have been just more and more legislation if one looked just at the headlines. Is the industry able to deal with it, and how will it handle it through 2012?
I think you've certainly seen some legislation coming through, but the big headline issue, of course, is emissions. And while we saw the Energy Efficiency Design Index, the big technical measures coming in to address emissions, accepted, or at least pushed through with some certain caveats, I don't think we've actually seen the full scope of the environmental legislation come anywhere near being accepted. That's going to continue to dominate the headlines in the IMO, in Brussels, the US, and across governments all over the world. And until you can find an international solution to that problem, I think a lot of other things are probably going to go under the radar.
Ballast water, that seems to be what everybody's also talking about from a technology perspective and an environmental perspective.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the ballast water is an interesting one because while the emissions has been the headline issue, the ballast water is a technical problem that the shipping industry can get a grip with. It's, the technology is there, they can implement it, it's going to cost you. But it's a piece of legislation that the shipping industry needs to react to. And it's interesting that the shipping industry has always been a very reactive industry. It's waited for legislation to come in and then reacted to it, which is what you're seeing with ballast water. With the emissions, we are seeing part of the industry trying to get ahead of the curve and trying to reduce emissions, trying to increase efficiency, partly through fuel costs and price motivation on their part, but also because there is a certain inevitability that carbon is going to be a real driving factor in terms of strategy for the next decade.
It would be tempting to say that the Chinese are not serious about the environment, but actually is that fair?
No, I think that's utter rubbish. I think they've been unfairly painted as the country that's putting the brakes on negotiations, which I don't think is necessarily true. I think the shipping industry is dealing with politics that's well beyond its control. Certainly within the IMO, but even beyond that into the United Nations Framework on Climate Change Convention, and through any other UN agency. I think China has a role to play in that and an obvious vested interest in how it plays that out. But if you look at the amount that the Chinese government's investing in environmental technology and policy, it's actually some of the most innovative legislation is coming out of China, not out of Europe.
And how are you guys on Lloyd's List going to cover the environmental story in 2012?
Well, I think the key here is how much it's going to affect ship owners. I think the politics that's well beyond our control is somewhat ephemeral, and there's no point in trying to predict the global legislation. But what you can predict is that you are going to have to account for carbon at some level. Now, whether that's through a market-based mechanism of trading standards in terms of emissions or levy, the basic fundamentals are that ship owners are going to have to worry about how much carbon is coming out of their ships. They're going to have to start implementing systems to account for it, and then they're going to have to worry about whether or not this is an opportunity they can take in terms of trading or a threat in terms of how they actually mitigate the regulation when it does come in.
Well, it seems like you're going to have a lot to write about in 2012, so good luck with that, Richard.